Hello, and welcome to another of our Defense Medical Ethics Center lectures on key topics and domains of bioethics that are important to, if not vital for, military medical practice. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Edmund Howe, MD, JD, of the Defense Medical Ethics Center and Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences here in Bethesda, to discuss research and research ethics that grounds research as a moral enterprise. And it becomes important to discuss not only the ethical methods and methodological overviews, but those instances from history that have provided examples of good research and practice and abrogations of the ethical principles that underscore and guide probitious research, content, and execution. It becomes important for clinicians to understand that the practice of medicine is in many ways based upon not only the education one receives as a medical student and then longitudinally throughout one's medical career vis-a-vis what we're doing here today, but also that research feeds both the educational aspect in providing a basis for information that becomes viable data that can be used in evidence-based medicine and practice, but also learns from practice itself. And we can expand our practice parameters by the understanding that each and every one of our patients represents something of an experiment with an N of 1. This interaction and the reciprocity of medical practice, medical research, and medical education establishes what is referred to as the medical triune, the all-in-one of these three capacities, where practice represents an ongoing process of incorporating contemporary research via a process of continuing education and learning from that practice to then inform research, to then provide the informational basis of education, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this really gets us down to the basis of science and what it is. It comes from the Latin scire, to know. And we can examine science in three principal yet interactive domains: knowledge that is obtained through the systemized processes of the scientific method, the systematization of that knowledge, the formalization of information through its validation, the peer review, and then the idea that science must, by its nature, be self-critical and self-revising, and then the use of that science in practice, expertness and skill and proficiency resulting from that knowledge in its domains of application, proverbially bench to bedside. Well, science is a profession, and as such, science informs the profession of medicine. Here, I think a simple explanation of the roots of the word profession, profitere, a public declaration of capabilities and skills, bespeaks the capabilities and skills that are afforded to the clinician by evidence-based medicine, or perhaps more aptly, medicine-based evidence. But a profession is more than that. The profession of science, to inform the profession of medicine, must maintain an equal set of moral, ethical, and legal standards so as to maintain some consensus and alignment of its professional stature. And a profession can be defined as those occupations involving a formal education that are differentiated from other occupations by their code of internal and prescriptions. And the professions serve individuals and the public through such claims that establish and fortify and sustain the basis of trust. Ergo, clinicians trust the science to be able to inform them in those ways that allow the capability of patients to trust the clinicians. And this really gets us into the idea of science and medicine as reciprocal practices. Here coming from the Greek, praxis, a doing, something that is iterative, not necessarily just a building. The formal Greek term for that is a poiesis, but a praxis. But perhaps a more contemporary definition of a practice is afforded by the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who has defined a practice as an exchange of good between agents that is defined by the nature and scope of their relationship. A nature of good. Good for whom? Well, this brings us back to the probity of medicine. Good for the patient's best interest. The biomedical good for that patient's choices, good for that patient as a person, good for the existential basis of the human condition. How is it then that science can and should inform the intimacy, the fidelity of medical practice? Well, in this regard, science as a profession serves both individuals in science and individuals in the public and the public at large. It provides the tools for inquiry, critique, validation, and the provision of knowledge to maintain medicine in its most contemporary state to be able to afford the nature of trust that is so important to not only the clinical encounter, but the practice of medicine as a field. Well, the philosophical basis of anything realistically entails each and all of the following domains. A passive domain, if you will, the metaphysical. This provides and adheres to a worldview. In this particular case, it's a naturalistic worldview. And this is important to understand because through our science, we can understand the way the world works. But the thing we cannot do is go beyond the natural. Science can understand the way people respond and or process what they feel may be paranormal or supernatural things. But the toolkit of science focuses on the natural world and allows us a deeper, more detailed understanding, a more deeper and detailed access, and a greater capability to affect the natural world that is the human organism and its ecology, which is the substrate of medicine. In so doing, it provides the epistemological basis of any philosophy. It affords ways of knowing and the intellectual capital, in this case, it translates into the capabilities of medicine as a profession and practice. And this is enacted in the human domain. Even veterinary medicine is enacted in accordance with the human domain as human enterprise. Look, animals don't go to vet school. Humans do, because we as humans have determined what represents the right and good care of those animals in our charge. But as soon as we talk about right and good care of anything, a discussion of what is right and good brings us squarely into the ethical domain, where now ethics provides formal analyses and systems of moral decision-making and enactment. But of course, if the profession of science is going to inform the profession of medicine, then they both have to be aligned with regard to their moral infrastructure and ethical functions. This then brings us to the essence, the core of what science is. I think it's pretty defeasible to say that knowledge is just knowledge for knowledge's sake. We do science for a reason. And there is a very defensible argument that knowledge is gained for some end. And to be frank, science is a human enterprise for human enterprise. We as humans have developed our science, our scientific method, and our scientific tools, and we put them to use in human endeavors so as to be able to gain knowledge about and capabilities for those endeavors. In this case, the endeavor is medicine. So what science is seeking to do is seeking to provide knowledge toward elucidation of some construct of truth. Why? Because that truth allows us to do things in ways that are both right, and in that way, establish parameters of what would be good for patients' best interest, individually and communally. And practical goodness entails rightness, technical rightness, methodological rightness. And this exists as a sometimes fragile fiduciary. Is the science being conducted in ways that are technically right, but also morally, ethically, and legally good? This then brings us to the idea of a combinatory and reciprocal internal structure of science as a tool of medicine and medicine as a tool of enacting some good within a community, in this case, the military, or writ large, the public. As a profession, any profession claims structural rules, duties. Now, the formal term here is deontologies, which we'll talk about momentarily, to enable its function. And it allows expert knowledge and practical wisdom to be gained and fortified so that then individuals in those professions can steward that knowledge to those who trust them. And ultimately, this self-criticism and self-revising step where the science is done in ways that are technically right, but also in ways that are ethically and morally sound to maintain the ethical probity of those dimensions that science will be applied, in this case, medicine, upholds the overall trust. The trust of the clinician with science, the trust of society with science, the trust of society, communities, and individuals with medicine. But all of this exists as a delicate balance. It asks the question, how do we work? How do we work at medicine? How do we work at science? And how do these things reciprocally and interactively engage? The ethicist and philosopher Hannah Arendt was very interested in the way that people work. And as you may be aware, one of Arendt's more critical works was an explanation and explication of those individuals who were involved in executing components of what came to be known as the Shoah or the Holocaust, particularly the misuse of science and technology to be able to be destructive to whole groups and communities of people. And as you may know, Arendt was very interested in examining some of the defense and explanations of the then convicted war criminal Adolf Eichmann, one of the principal architects primarily of the transportation of large numbers of individuals to concentration and death camps. She expected to see a monster, and what she saw was a middle-level bureaucrat. But what she actually saw was an individual who did not pick their head up, if you will, from the work table to be able to assess, evaluate, and adjudicate the work and its effects that were being done. Arendt claimed, and rightly so, that humans can work in one of two ways: brute workings that slave away without consideration or concern for the process or product or consequences of the efforts, which she referred to as anima laborans, literally working animalistically. Or we can embrace the fact that we are Homo sapiens, the knowledgeable human, and turn that knowledge both inward to ourselves and outward to our tasks to work in a way that Arendt referred to as homo faber. Reflection, consideration, and concern for the ends and the means that occur during the efforts of our creation. Indeed, in looking at Adolf Eichmann, one of the things that Arendt did was draw even further back the veil that uncovered the horrors of the abrogation of the good of science that was conducted under the Hitler regime in Germany during the 30s and 40s. And that can be used as a primary exemplar, and Professor Howe will provide others. But the primacy of that exemplar is that what came from the trying of those individuals who conducted those war crimes and what was to be leveraged as crimes against humanity, although that was not the formal charge, ultimately became the basis for a code of research and clinical ethics. Biomedicine in Nazi Germany was mainly affiliated with the military medical system and or the militarization, or at least formal uniform systemization of the medical system as an organ of the state. There was the conflation of sociopolitics with biomedicine. And this came to light during the doctor's trial of the Nuremberg Tribunal, most notably in the case of the United States versus Dr. Karl Brandt, 9th of December, 1946 until midsummer 1947. And as a consequence of these trials, where many of the individuals were convicted and ultimately went to the gallows for their crimes, a code was developed called the Nuremberg Code. 10 primary precepts: voluntary consent, yield fruitful results, designed and based upon prior experimentation that does not do any undue risk. In fact, mental and physical suffering should be minimized to both animals and humans. Realistically, the degree of risk should never exceed the humanitarian importance. Proper preparations to prepare facilities for the experimental subject. Only scientifically qualified persons should participate. The highest degree of knowledge and skill. The human subject should be at liberty to terminate the research and should understand all components of it, and consent is paramount. That consent must be informed to the knowledge that is available at that time. These are key ethical principles. These are key ethical ideas and concepts. Professor Edmund Howe will now talk about historical examples that can be used as stepping stones to understand how science is conducted in ways that are right and good, and how abrogations and deviations from such technical rectitude and moral and ethical goodness have created, if you will, a case file of what not to do. Professor Howe, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Giordano. I'll be taking off from the framework that Dr. Giordano set out for us in asking the question, how does what Dr. Giordano just talked about apply? And I'll be relating both the key principles of research ethics previously, after Nuremberg, and now some of the history and some of how this applies today, including at the USIS IRB. Well, a first principle is, as Dr. Giordano mentioned, protecting participants. Now that came out of actually Sloan Kettering had research going on where an attending was injecting live cancer cells into patients. It turned out that these cells weren't doing any harm, but some of the residents rounding with him said, gee, we think these patients should know what's going on. And so out of that came a principle of autonomy, that namely, even if you're not harming participants in research, you should inform them what's going on. That came directly out of Nuremberg, of course. Well, a second principle related to autonomy is not only giving participants the information that they need to decide whether to participate or not, but giving them the opportunity to say no, not to coerce them. And historically, a big study that contributed to that view was a study of Stanley Milgram, who actually had people come in off the street, and an authority in a white coat said, look, we have some research we want you to do. So they'd come in, and then they had to test some subjects, one might say, behind a glass who were taking a test. And the only trick was that if they got something wrong, the participant from the street had to shock them, and each time shock them higher and higher, until some of these, quote, subjects taking tests behind this window would scream in agony. Well, what Milgram found was that many people would continue to do that torture, if you will, even though they thought it was wrong because an authority had told them to do so. Now, I've actually met with Milgram back in the early 60s, and he pled with me and others with whom he was talking to, based on his experiment, particularly to never do what authorities told us to do without questioning it, as, again, Dr. Giordano's talk refers to in his philosophical grounding of ethics. So, one wants to give participants information to choose freely whether to participate. One wants to not coerce them. Well, then there are questions that come up of those sick who are internally coerced, of course, by wanting to get well from their illness, and children who maybe don't have the capacity to fully evaluate what they're told. And a very well-known theologian in research ethics, Paul Ramsey, is known for saying that with children, you may have a harm either way from not doing research with them or from doing it. But that's the nature of life. Hans Jonas, on the other hand, another famous figure in research ethics, said, well, if we've got to do children, at least we can do it in the least harmful way, starting, for example, with adults who have capacity. And those adults might be, for example, doctors, PhDs, and so on, who are most knowledgeable about the research risks. Students in medical school, of course, always love that example because that would mean their children possibly up the line. And then there are questions of soldiers, of course, who are used to taking orders. And so if they're in a situation where someone higher in rank says, yes, I'd like some people to be in a study, there's always the risk that they might feel coerced. And for that reason, there are now strict firewalls separating service members who do research from even being sometimes in the room of those they want to participate. And then, of course, there's adequate information, which is part of autonomy. And there's the famous Tuskegee research results where participants were not told that there were cures for the syphilis or treatments for it, but were allowed to stay in the study to be able to study the effects. Well, now that has moved to the idea of informing participants and being sure that they're informed by presenting materials at an 8th grade level at least, and ideally, though this often isn't done, giving potential research participants time to discuss the pros and cons of entering a research protocol as opposed to not entering. And we can go further from there. And when we go from there, we look to Willowbrook, another famous point in research ethics. And here, Willowbrook was a institution where there were a number of children who didn't have parents. And so there were some researchers, well-minded, as is often the case, wanting to find some sort of better treatments and preventive methods for hepatitis. And so they figured they'd artificially give it to some of these children who were at Willowbrook. And they had two arguments in favor of that. One is that just like chickenpox in my day, if you got it early, you felt good because then you wouldn't get such a severe case later on. You'd have some immunity, as it were. And also these kids at Willowbrook would not only be less vulnerable for more severe hepatitis later if they got it artificially earlier on, but they would get nicer housing while they were in the research. Well, others said, wait a minute, one is exploiting that vulnerable population for others' benefits. And this relates to what Dr. Giordano was talking about when he talked about the means as well as the ends. So the ends were reasonable, but it was using these children as means to that end and giving them then the risk of an undue burden. And this whole idea of exploiting a vulnerable population applies to doing research on soldiers. And by soldiers, of course, I include all the different services. But for matters of time, I'll just use soldiers. Now, soldiers already risk life and limb for the greater society. So if there's risky research and one asks them because they're a convenient population for military researchers, one is exploiting their vulnerability so that in theory, one might rather distribute the risks by going to civilians. So that brings us to the whole question of equality and equal access. That is, all people being able to benefit ideally from the benefits of research, if, for example, they have some illness and there's no treatment for it, and some of the risks of illness. So what does that mean practically? If you're at USIS, for example, and doing research, it means you might want to have in your protocol funds for babysitters and transportation for downtown inner city parents in DC so that they could participate, as well as, and in addition to, participants better off perhaps from Bethesda, which is where USIS is located. And going ahead, we want to avoid harm as another major principle, again, from the Belmont Report. And there are various ways one can do that. For example, when guns go off, they could cause some sort of deafness 20 years up the line. So what do you do about that harm if you're testing a new rifle, let us say? Well, one of the things that you could do is use a huge blast tunnel and put a small number of soldiers, one or two, at one end of it and have a little blast from the rifle and measure the eardrum so that you can detect the harm at its earliest level, if there is one, starting with small numbers, as I mentioned, low doses, as I mentioned, and adults before children, as I mentioned, as particularly in the example of Hans Jonas. And going on from there, we can look at other specific types of research. And one example here is lasers. Now, the military has an interest in wanting to protect its soldiers from the harms of lasers. So every now and then, there will be studies that come about that, okay, we want to test this new salve that one can put so that soldiers won't get a bad sunburn, for example. And that's a principle of using small doses causing a sunburn, nothing more severe. Well, that same research might be used to develop weaponry, namely lasers that can, for example, possibly blind enemy soldiers who are shooting up to try and shoot planes out of the sky. Well, the question that raises in principle is to what degree, if any, should persons, particularly those who have pledged themselves to cure patients, for example, through medicine? Should they be working on offensive weaponry or not? And there's been profound changes in that over the last several decades, where a secretary of health affairs at one time said, nope, he didn't want doctors participating at all in offensive weaponry. Well, one of the other controversial issues is, what about controls? Dr. Giordano mentioned the importance of having scientific method and results, and that requires the gold standard of controls. Well, how do you get children that are healthy as controls? Well, there are different views on that, including differences in defense research for the Department of Defense versus civilian. So it's a controversial area. And often researchers have to come up with some way that healthy children as controls are going to benefit. And so that's an exercise sometimes in imagination as well as integrity. And then there are patients with dementia. How do you get consent from that group to participate so that you can then get treatments and preventive treatments for that group? Well, one of the questions that's come up, not yet resolved, is that what if someone's been an altruist for their entire, let us say, 90 years of living, so that they haven't given previous consent to be a participant in research, but the best guess from all those who love them is they would want to if they had that chance. Should they be considered as participants? An unanswered question at this point. Well, there are then additional questions as that once someone with dementia is a participant, their dementia may increase. So at first, when you do a blood draw every 3 months, they may say yes. But what if then after 9 months, they say no? Does it mean no? Well, we know that sometimes people with dementia may say no today and yes tomorrow. So that raises the question of how many checks are warranted. If they say no on one day, should you ask on a second day or even a third? Or put simply, what means no? Well, then there are questions of what standards we should use for all these, because standards may differ from one community or country from another. And this comes up when we might have our standard for who should participate in research, but other countries might have other standards, particularly if they're developing and not as well off as our country. Well, test case on that. One's car gets stuck at 3 a.m. as it goes off the road, perhaps driving home from a late night, and then one calls up a tow truck. And the tow truck comes and says, okay, I'll tow you at 3 a.m., get your car out of there, but it's going to cost you $3,000. What's your gut response? It might be, wow, that's outlandish. Well, one might rethink that. And let us say that the tow truck driver, that's what he, she, they do to be able to put breakfast on the table for their children. Then it looks a little bit more reasonable, but let's look at it another way, based on principle. Okay, I win if I get my car towed, and I've had a free choice, and the tow truck driver wins. So might win-win situations be an exception to the general notion of not exploiting others' vulnerability? Well, perhaps. That's one of the new wrinkles on the Kantian notion of not exploiting others as means for others' ends, as we've talked about previously. Well, then there are questions of how you're going to do research on pregnant women, which we'll talk about a little bit later. For HIV research, there are questions of that's a vulnerable population, and if you have some treatment that's going to prevent persons from getting HIV, well, the way you want to do the study, perhaps, is to have a control group of those who take risks and those who don't, and seeing whether your preventive means works. How are you going to do that? Same question arose with SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. At one time, no one knew if that was a risk of children lying when they're infants on their stomachs as opposed to their backs. Well, how do you do that definitive study with a control group? What do you tell parents If you tell parents, look, there might be some risk if you put your child on his, her, or their stomach, the parents might not do it, so you might never find out. So how do you do that? HIV vaccines, I was alluding to a few minutes ago, and there's even Alzheimer's disease vaccine questions that come up. And that issue is, well, okay, maybe you'll have to do tests when persons are in their 20s to see if they're at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease, to then give them vaccines to see if these vaccines work. Well, are there harms from saying to persons 20 years old, well, we've tested you and you have a little bit higher risk of having dementia later on at 80 or 90 or 100? All questions that continue to arise as we look at research ethics today. And we can go ahead to consent. There are questions of inherent consent that we've changed greatly over the years. I mentioned soldiers, and one of the colorful notions is that soldiers at Aberdeen, which is in Maryland, where that was perhaps not the most exciting place to be as a soldier, so that it might be that you'd change tires as part of your daily routine. So researchers wanting to have that group as participants showed them beaches of groups playing volleyball out on the beaches where they could be for 2 weeks in research. And the notion was to show that group of soldiers those sort of alternatives might be exploiting their vulnerability as soldiers at Aberdeen. Thus, they're the firewalls now that I spoke about earlier. And I think in that regard of my own experience in college, where I was sitting in a room trying to rate bad tasting crackers, and actually what the study was that some people were put in a room with another individual, and the study was trying to figure out whether people would leave earlier and no longer taste bad tasting crackers sooner if they had someone with them, which they sort of did. Well, that speaks to the idea of even that degree of coercion, of saying, all right, first year college student, you need to be in this research. To pass the course would be too coercive. So now there's options that must be made, such as writing essays, what have you. Another more subtle idea from the past is that to overcome coercion, you might want to have, quote, shills, unquote, in your audience. For example, if you have 100 soldiers and you're informing them about consent, informing them with someone in plain clothes so they don't feel coerced, you might plant, in theory, 2 or 3 or 4 people within that group of 100 soldiers to say, nope, I don't want to volunteer, just to make it easier for the other 96 or so to say, well, I guess I won't either. And of course, this has affected use of students as well in the past. At one time, they were asked to give urine for research going on at USIS. And here I'm talking about going back to 1977, so it's a while back, but no more. And we can go on from there. To pregnant women. And here there's questions of when to test them, and this illustrates the principle of equity. Namely, what you could do ideally is have pregnant women coming in for prenatal testing, and at that time discuss research you wanted to do, and they think about it as we talked about, have time, and then when they came in to deliver, you could do your research. Well, the problem is not everybody gets prenatal care. Some people come in the ER to deliver for the first time when they're already in labor. So if you wanted to include that group or extend equity to include that group as well, you would not be able to inform them in the same way so they could discuss it. So when should you do that is the question. And then there are even questions that have come up in regard to soldiers that are related also. For example, there's notions that have come about periodically of having special bandages that one could use during combat that could help clot and perhaps save lives. Well, how do you get permission from soldiers to do that experiment on the battlefield? That involves more complex thinking and IRB questions of how to do that, and I leave that to your imagination as we go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Howe. What those examples have brought to the fore and hopefully have shed light upon is the need for prudence, practical wisdom, prudence in practice, if you will. Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics defined practical wisdom, calling it phronesis, as a balancing trait, the fulcrum of a balance that balances our intellectual virtues and capabilities with morally sound intent, actions, and applications. And if we think about that, essentially, this creates the critical balance through which research can be conducted and how research can then be utilized in responsible ways within medicine. A balance. Using our intellectual virtues, seeking ways of knowing, engaging ways of knowing, developing ways of knowing and what we know, and doing that with morally sound intent, morally sound actions, and ethically propitious applications. But to do this, we have to de-silo science and ethics. Ethics is not the bolt-on that comes consequential to engaging the science, nor is ethics necessarily the prohibition against engaging good science, even if that science is avant-gardistic. Rather, we've called for a consilience, a coming together, keeping science, technology, ethics, and policy in a more uniformed way, in a more integrated way. In other words, keeping the science and the ethics in pace, in step, in the same rhythm as marching orders to be able to serve the good of medicine. We call that in step, integrated science, technology, ethics, and policy. Recall that ethics, formal systematic studies of morality and doing good. There are numerous ethical systems, for sure. There are some that seem to be more normative. This is an absolute good or an absolute wrong, at least in relative terms to that system of ethics, and others that are defined as being more applied. In truth be known, they exist along a continuum. We apply normative practices each and every day in a variety of different approaches and applications. In some, however, I think the ethical reasoning process can be distilled down into these 7 basic steps. First, recognize the facts. And in some cases, the facts are we don't have all the facts. Number 2, define and recognize if there indeed is a moral and ethical issue. Is it simply a matter of communication, miscommunication, lack of communication, or is there something really there? And in some cases, miscommunication can be the source, or at very, very least, the charge, the spark, that then leads to the development of a full-blown ethical issue. Ethical issues occur in situations with individuals, agents, and actors, and it's needs important to recognize who those individuals and actors are and what their roles and interests are. And from that point, we get to the first step in resolving any ethical question. It's the same thing we use in clinical medicine. It's the same thing we use in research. What can be done? Given these circumstances, situations, facts, agents, actors, roles, and interests, what are our alternative actions? What can be done appropriately? In other words, what can be done that is rightly? And then in examining these things, what are the moral sources of their action? And ultimately, what might be their short, intermediate, and long-term consequences? A bit of modeling goes on. Well, in medicine, we call this resolving equipoise, and it's no different when examining ethical issues, inclusive of examining ethical issues that raise their head in the scope, tenor, and conduct of research. Of all those things that can be done, what should be done, and why? And in some cases, we have to then further discern, can we actually do the things we should? And if we can't, well, what do we do then? This then gets us down to the issue of trying to do good, but at least not harming. And there has been discussion from my research group and others that the principal maxim of research is not just to do good, because that good may be in the long term. And given that it's research, we don't necessarily know the outcome. Thus, by default, the primary maxim of research is non-harm. And non-harm in research then communicates into allowing the clinician to utilize that research in ways to do good. Well, what then are the ethical systems that allow us some guidance and governance of the research practices, particularly in biomedicine? Well, I think fundamental in research in general and certainly to biomedical research, and absolutely to military medical research, is an ethics of duty or obligation, more formally referred to as a deontological ethics. Deontos is duty, logos is a rational accounting. It's a rational accounting and use of our duties. This form of ethics has been most characteristically associated with the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And accordingly, one acts not only in accordance with an obligation or duty, but because it is your duty. I am just doing my duty. Well, the issues and problems with that become fairly evident. What if your duty isn't right? What if duties conflict? Well, certainly there is a duty to do research, arguably so. The idea of evidence-based medicine is important upon obtaining medicine-based evidence. So the duty to do the research is there. The duty to report clinical findings is there. The duty to engage research in practice is there. The duty to the individual and the community within military medicine is there. And the advantages of duty is that it's widely used in service professions, and it establishes the obligatory roles and the pre and proscriptions of what one should do, and therefore defines the scope and parameters of your decisions and actions. This is my duty. This is what I should do. In other words, buy that ticket, take this ride. But like anything else, ethics are a toolkit, and there are always limitations as well as capabilities with tools. And in this case, the limitations of the duties can conflict. Early on in discussing the philosophy of military medicine, we referred back to Professor Howe's initial work and his ongoing work that looked at the duties of military medicine with regard to the duties of the military and the duties of medicine. And although some may purport that these duties conflict, Professor Howe has reconciled them in recognizing that these are indeed a continuum of being able to heal the individual and help the collective. But the other problem here is that such duties can become universal vis-a-vis what we saw, for example, in Nuremberg and during the Hitler regime. Those members of military services that were conducting their research on prisoners and on political detainees were doing so because they felt that was their duty, and the duties of the state as defined within the precepts of the Third Reich was such that there was the idea of a Gleichschaltung. Everyone shall do the same thing. And those obligations became universal and superseded the individual's capability to look at the ethical probity and moral good of what it was they were doing. And in that way, duties can create certain ambiguity of what I can do and what I should do. Well, clearly the goals of medicine, just as the goals of research, are to create useful information and useful outcomes. Research studies that work, that demonstrate things, that are successful. And in such successes, and the lack of those successes, the overarching success is we know what can be done, what should be done, what shouldn't be done, what works and what doesn't, and perhaps in whom. And that's useful in serving the obligate ethical responsibilities of science and research to the obligate professional responsibilities of medicine. So we're looking to do good. We're looking to do good as a basis of rule, certain rules that allow us to do good. And then we have certain latitudes within those rules to define what is good, what is harm, and exercise both accordingly given the situation. And the utilitarian ethics assesses consequences as those that are going to be the most useful, the most good, and the least harmful. And it evaluates the good in terms of the greatest balance of benefits over harms to individuals and the greatest number of individuals. And this certainly is axiomatic to military medicine. Again, healing individuals so as to help the collective of the force. The advantages of such an ethic in research is that it focuses upon best outcomes. It seems to maximize the right and the good. And it's a very familiar way of thinking. I mean, in each and all of our decisions throughout our daily lives, we weigh things in terms of their relative valence. Is this good? Is this not good? Is this good for me? Is it not good for me? Is it good for others? Research, no different. But here, too, it tends to justify the ends and in some cases may subordinate the means. Let's face it, as we said earlier, the good of some can weigh against the good of others. And if what we're looking to do is just get good outcomes, well, the problem with that is that it, in that way, may supersede our view to what we're doing to get those outcomes. You know, there's an ongoing debate as to whether or not some of the results that were conducted in military medicine during the Third Reich period actually have validity and probity. And certainly the validity of many of the experiments are there. As you may know, I served my military time as an aerospace physiologist an aerospace medicine specialist with the United States Navy and Marine Corps. And many of the experiments that were paradigmatic, but a prototypic high altitude, hypothermic endurance and resilience research were actually conducted under ethically, at very, very least questionable, if not problematic and criminal conditions during the Third Reich period. Should we use those data? Should we use those results? Or is it simply that the means were ethically inappropriate, if not morally corrupt, and therefore that negates the ends? Well, you heard earlier that ethics of principle play a role, and they certainly do in medicine, as developed directly from the Nuremberg Code that became part of the Belmont Report that ultimately was the document that established the well-known principles of biomedical ethics by Tom Beecham and Jane Childress. Developed and advocated the use of what's called mid-level principles. In other words, these are principles that are not necessarily wedded to any core philosophical grounding, but on their own are each and all valid. Beneficence, doing good; non-maleficence, not harming; respect for individuals' autonomy, at very least, their ability to refuse certain treatments or participations in research; and justice, in other words, who gets the goodies, not only in an ideal sense, but in a realistic sense in terms of distribution of relatively constrained means, resources, and ends, and not necessarily rational actors. But we know these ethics well. For those of you who are working in the clinical professions, you've been inculcated with the idea of the four principles as one of the fundamentals of ethical training in medicine. The advantage is that these principles are compatible with a number of different philosophical orientations, inclusive of a philosophy of military medicine, because they are, as we say, prima facie. In other words, at first face, they're all valid. Nobody's going to argue that doing good is a bad thing. Nobody's going to argue that not harming is a bad thing, or respect for autonomy or justice. But where do they go? What order? And that same prima facie basis fails to provide a grounding moral base. And not all principles are correct in all circumstances. For example, in research, if I want to do good and get good results, does it really matter how I get there? Do I have to make sure that all of my research subjects continue with the nature of the research, particularly if I know that if I lose certain members of the research subject pool, it's going to affect my research and therefore render it invalid, non-useful? And what does that do to those who continue to participate? So we can see that just trying to balance doing good, non-harm, autonomy, and justice can sometimes be problematic. But recall that one of the things we're advocating through DMEC is a structural and functional approach to ethics that utilizes different ethical systems as part of a working toolkit. A duty of the profession, both scientifically and medically. An appreciation for good means and good ends, utility and outcomes and conduct. Putting these in principle, trying to do good, avoiding harm, where avoiding harm may be the principle that is fundamental to research because we don't know how the research is going to turn out, so we seek to minimize harm at very, very least. But we also respect and allow our research subjects the autonomy to withdraw without penalty. And what we're trying to do is make sure that for those individuals who are research subject, there is just distribution of those goods and resources and services so that, in fact, it is balanced. So that even those individuals who may be in control group are not necessarily suffering undue harms. And when it comes to the way we use science and medicine, here we have to appreciate the intersection of communities. We're focusing on moral decision-making is focused upon the ideals and goals of a particular group of individuals that define themselves as a community, in this case, science for medicine. And further, science for military medicine. In this case, the focus is on what is good both for the individuals that are involved in the research and or in the biomedical applications, and the coherent group itself, the collective. Studying individuals and groups to help and heal individuals so as to help and maximize the effect of the collective. And this too has certain advantages and limitations. Certainly working within that community, it grounds whatever is the enterprise to the goals, orientations, and moralities of the community, grounding science to medicine. The ends of medicine are paramount to the conduct of the science that informs it. And in this case, both science and medicine are applicable and focal to the goals and aims of the military and the individuals who provide the basis of that population of the collective. But this question comes up frequently when we're looking at military medical research, that such goods and such community values can be narrowly defined. They can be segregationist with regard to who gets these things in the military, or how certain members of the military might be, in fact, participatory in research and or its products. And given that it serves a number of collectives, most proximately the military collective, and perhaps more intermediately or distally, the collective of humanity at large, it can, in fact, sacrifice the good of some individuals to some good of the group. Think about vaccine research. Think about many of the other research examples that were provided for you by Professor Howe. Think about the dynamic interaction of individuals who may have had their goals, their means, their ends, their desires, and how those could have become subjugated and subordinated to the overall good of the collective that comprised the research population in trying to serve the population of some collective, whether it's the public at large or the military, with the goods of what come out of that research. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, the ethical decisions that need to be made at the research bench and at the clinical bedside rest upon your shoulders. How will you, as an individual agent, be the responsible steward of knowledge, skill, and action? How will you embrace the intellectual virtues of theoretical knowledge, experiential knowledge, contextual knowledge, and practical wisdom? How will you engage that at the research bench to be able to develop theoretical and experiential knowledge, contextual knowledge? And how will you be practically wise in the way you conduct research, and do so in ways that upholds the moral virtues that are so important to your role as a professional? Doing good, being truthful, being trustworthy, being honest about what is known, what is not known, having some courage to boldly go where others may not have gone and defend those things that you feel are defensible. In doing so with a relative effacement of your own interest and balancing that upon practical wisdom. Well, these virtues are ancient. They're espoused since Aristotle, brought forward by Aquinas and grounded in our contemporaneity by philosophers such as James Richels and Edmund Pellegrino and Alistair MacIntyre, among others. They're certainly compatible with almost any other ethical system because they provide the individual with an ethical toolkit to navigate these terrains. But there are some problems. Is the common good applicable in all situations? Is there consensus of virtues and values? What does that mean? And can ethics and virtue be taught and assessed? At the end of the day, ethics and research and practice comes down to balance. Doing right, technically right. Doing good. Good for whom? On what levels? It forces us to balance burdens, risks, and harms with identifiable benefits. And both benefits, burdens, risks, and harms must be viewed as those of commission. In other words, benefits, risks, and harms of doing the thing, or benefits, burdens, risks, and harms of not doing the thing in the proximate, intermediate, and long-term sense. So to sum up, one of the things that we've advocated is this heterodox model of applied ethics. In other words, a multiple perspectivity of ethics that allows us to develop a real ethical toolkit. What are the duties and rules of your profession as a scientist, as a military member, as a physician? What are the maximum benefits that you seek to gain and optimize within your identified group and to those as possible? And at the same time, what harms are you looking to minimize? What are your obligations to community, to care for individuals and the groups involved? And how do you exercise that in practice as your professional obligations, responsibilities, and roles? A schematic of how this works is essentially as follows. The structure of ethics for research, for medicine, for military professionalism is defined and prescribed and proscribed by duties and rules. And ultimately, we take these into our daily actions to exercise our agency as professionals, given the roles we occupy as research professionals, as clinical professionals, and as military professionals, to guide our decisions and actions to those with whom we interact and those upon whom we have trusting relationships. This then brings us squarely to what constitutes responsible conduct of research. As promulgated by the Office of Research Integrity, it's the practice of investigation with integrity that involves awareness and application of norms and principles in the performance of any and all activities related to research. Well, if that's what responsible conduct is, generalizable misconduct, as well as the ethical improbities of not providing consent, of mistreating subjects, of not maintaining the respect for the vulnerability and autonomy of research subjects and their roles in the study and beyond. These can also involve research misconduct on a variety of levels, most notably fabrication, falsification of plagiarism in proposing, performing, reviewing, and reporting the research, violation of ethical standards of human and animal care, and even such things as ghostwriting, not giving credit where it's due, or not assigning credit and or authorship, attribution, and transparency where it's necessary. But what do we do in these ethical bases when these moral prescriptions are transcended or transgressed? Well, realistically, suspicion or findings of research misconduct require that there be significant departure from these accepted practices within the relevant research community. And this is not just, for example, naivete or simply an oversight, but rather is an intentional commission, knowingly and or recklessly. And that the evidence must support the preponderance of culpability. It's not just honest errors, not just differences of opinion or naivete, but rather that some perhaps malfeasance occurred. Malfeasance, a legal term that has diffused into the ethical milieu. In other words, knowing that something is wrong, but doing it anyway. Yes, naturalistic mistakes that can occur due to honest error, oversight, mis or underappreciation of rules. Well, that can happen. And the mea culpa there is evident and should be done. My fault, my bad. Stand tall, locked and docked. Correction, early correction office. The office of correction needs to be with those individuals who committed the error and or their supervisors. And very often the idea of correction early and through office becomes an important self-regulatory tool in the oversight of research in medicine and in military medicine. But there are those times when things go wrong, and they go wrong by intention, or they go wrong by recklessness. They go wrong by malfeasance, and sometimes they go wrong because there is some intentionality to be able to get to the ends and not pay attention to the means. What do we do when it happens? Well, this is where it really incorporates more into the auspices of medical and research law. Research institutions such as funding entities and agencies realistically are partners for the responsibility of the research process in any and all of the studies and investigations that they fund. Federal agencies, inclusive of the military, maintain ultimate oversight, but the research institutions themselves are the primary locus, the primary nexus that connects the researcher, the research, the conduct of the researcher and that research to those institutions that have underwritten, supported, and or guided the research itself. In this case, the military and other federal entities. Well, what happens when something goes wrong? What happens when, in fact, it has been found that there have been abrogations of ethical conduct of research, and as such, there have been not only allegations, but demonstrations of research misconduct, irresponsible research? There are a number of steps. There could be steps taken to research the research record. Perhaps least problematic is a letter of reprimand. In other words, you did something wrong, don't do it again. There can be certain impositions of assurance requirements to assure compliance with regulations. Or it can become somewhat more severe, a relative defrocking, if you will, a suspension or termination of not only the funds and administrative authority to conduct the research, but with the researcher's capability and professional competencies and, if you will, certification to conduct research at that time and in the future. Well, such suspension and debarment with applicable governmental rules is made publicly available. And you can find this through the list of parties excluded from federal procurement and procurement of programs by the General Services Administration. And yes, these things can be appealed, and very often an appeal process can be longitudinal, based upon nuances of the case that fall far within the legal domain rather than the ethical domain. And this then brings us back with regard to research, biomedical research, and military medical bioscientific research, to the intersection of ethics, morality, and law. Reiteratively, the adage says good ethics makes for good laws, but in reality, ethics make for prudent decisions about the scope and conduct of whatever activity it is within the tenor of the law. Ethics questions, analyzes and informs and provides guidances, but laws govern. And very often what we find is that ethical improprieties in research conduct very rapidly transgress into illegalities that are therefore overseen, governed, and retributively punished by law. So in sum, what we see is that research is indeed a moral obligation because it provides us the basis of knowledge that allows the epistemological basis of medicine to serve the good of individual and group patient interests. There's that trust between medicine and science. There's that trust between the community served in medicine and the community served in the science that informs medicine. But there's also become a valuable trust based upon history and historicity of various transgressions of research conduct that have demonstrated that research not only must be done in ways that is technically apt and correct, but must be ethically and legally sound. It's not easy. For easy, everyone would do it. Not everyone does. The conduct of research is such that there must be respect for the responsibilities that go along with the profession of biomedical research and respect for the obligations in serving of biomedical research to the biomedical clinical enterprise. I hope you found our lecture today informative and interesting. And certainly, as you know, the Defense Medical Ethics Center is always available for your questions, your inquiries, and your consultations. Thank you for your time and your interest.